Hey everybody, welcome to Board on the Floor. I'm Chris. This is my Robo Cup, and these are all of the minis I have currently managed to paint. Out of all of my collection, the only box I've actually completed in regards to painting the minis is Bloodborne. Only the core box, not the expansions, but this is all of them right there. Over here we have some Gloomhaven. Here we have a couple Kingdom Rush figures, and I started recently with Cthulhu Death May Die and Marvel United. I don't actually have the Marvel United box down here. It's upstairs on my desk because I'm currently in the middle of painting Taskmaster. What I wanted to do today was just talk about everything that I've learned so far in regards to painting minis. Because I've only been doing it since February, and I don't have a lot of expensive equipment. I pretty much have recyclable containers that my daughters usually use for their yogurt drinks, or pill bottles, dollar store cups, applesauce containers. I use a lot of things that I just happen to have around my house, and I wanted to talk about that because there is a way to approach this without spending a lot of money. Now, the paint and the brushes, of course, you could start off with something very basic or something very expensive. I went the basic route. Let's talk about feeling confident enough to start painting. When I first purchased Kingdom Rush, this was my first kind of big box game that I got. I ordered it online. It came pretty quick, and when I opened it up and I saw the minis, I thought I should probably figure out if I could paint these or not. And at the same time, I had gotten Cthulhu Death May Die, and those minis seemed very intimidating. So if you look at the difference between this and this, you could see the Kingdom Rush is a bit more straightforward and basic in regards to its design, but the Cthulhu Death May Die, this is Haster, has more tentacles than I could count. So I was very intimidated to start off with this one. So I thought going for the Kingdom Rush models, I thought it would be a better thing to start with. So I was very intimidated. And even when I started painting this figure, it ended up taking me about a day and a half before I felt like it actually looked more than just a blob of color. But even taking a look at it now, let's see if I'll show it up here. And then I'll put this down and then I'll show this one up here too. And so taking a look at my first mini, right now I see tons of things I would do differently. At the beginning too, I used these quick shades a lot because I thought they would give me more depth to some of my figures. But with quick shades, it only really works when you have a lot of detail in a mini. So if you take a look back over at Haster, I have used some quick shades on the area down here. And because of quick shades, the way they work, or contrast paints, Citadel calls them contrast paints, Army Painter calls them quick shades. But what they do is they kind of settle in all of the details. And so those areas end up being darker and the raised areas end up being lighter. So it adds a lot of contrast to that section. And so if you look at this kind of like sack of some sort, or these mouths areas, these all had contrast paint on them. And even the cloak, I did use a contrast paint, but I went back into it and did more highlights to it. But at the beginning, I thought the contrast paints or the quick shades would offer kind of like a fast way through making the minis look a little bit more professional. But it only really does work if there is a lot of detail. So when I used the quick shade on this mini, it darkened all the colors. And I thought for Kingdom Rush, it felt like it was a kind of game that needed brighter colors, more contrast. And in the end, I felt I was happy with this because it was my first model. But now that I look at it, I'm just like, I should probably go back and fix some things. Because even though it's only been 4 months since I started painting it, I feel like because I committed to almost like a full month and a half of painting every day, I put in at least an hour, I've improved quite a lot since then. I compare this first mini to the mini I literally painted last night. You can see there's quite a bit of improvement. Now, I also have learned to look at reference material a lot more. And with something like the Red Skull, obviously there's a lot of reference material out there. With this time character from Kingdom Rush, other than the artwork in the game, there's not a lot you could work off of. In regards to material and equipment, I'll quickly go through what I have and what I use. And the cheap things that I use all the time, this here, it is a piece of Tupperware that I flipped upside down, and I've used the cover for what's called a wet palette. All it is paper towel, you soak it, and then you put some parchment paper on top. You also make sure that the parchment paper is kind of saturated with water. What it does is it actually keeps your acrylic paint moist and it allows it to last longer while you're painting. If you just use like an actual palette or just a piece of plastic, the paint will dry up pretty quickly. Having a wet palette really does lengthen the amount of time you could actually use that paint. So the paint on here now, some of it is from last night when I was painting those 2 Marvel United figures, and it's still usable. Often it starts to separate. Some paints, you could see the pigment separating from the liquid, so you might just have to mix it back in. But putting together something like this costs you absolutely nothing. A real wet palette is in the range of around $30. Army Painter has one that you get pretty easily. Next, I would say brushes. And I have an assortment of brushes. Some I got at a store called Michael's, which is kind of like a craft store. I don't know if it's only in Canada or if it is in the States as well. At the beginning, I really suggest just buying cheap brushes because you won't know how to take care of your brushes. And if you buy an expensive brush right at the beginning, you're going to mess it up. You totally will, because it's just the techniques for cleaning brushes or even how you use a brush. It's a lot more complicated than you would think. Like, obviously, if you're painting and you just take a brush, it'll work. But when you want to have brushes that are going to last longer, when you're using them on models that are this small, obviously making sure your brushes keep a good point is important. And that's a lot harder to do than you would think. Having a good brush cleaner. So this is the one I use. Making sure the brush you use to mix your paint isn't the brush you're going to use to paint your models, because mixing paint, if you get some paint past the edge here of the bristles, I think it's called the ferrule. If you get paint past that area, it could get stuck inside there and it could split the hairs. And so you'll no longer have a brush that comes to a fine point. So using different brushes for mixing and different brushes to actually paint is kind of something you learn as you move along. And it was something I didn't know at the beginning. So thankfully I bought some cheap brushes and I painted my first couple of minis. And then I thought I was upgrading by buying some brushes off of Amazon. When I got them, I thought they were going to be like weasel hair or something like that, but they actually weren't. They were just synthetic brushes. And so I thought I was upgrading, but I actually wasn't. And I only recently bought my first kind of brush that I consider to be an upgrade, because one brush itself was, I think it was $7 at Michael's. But the most important thing really when it comes to brushes is just making sure that you kind of keep that fine tip, especially if you're working with models this small. Because as much as these minis are small, there's smaller ones that you'll get. Like if you're playing something like Seventh Continent or Destinies, the minis are quite tiny. So having a brush that keeps its point is very important, which means that cleaning it properly and maintaining the brush itself is important for something like that. I actually bought this brush and I'm too intimidated to use it. It's still exactly the same way as when I bought it. And last night when I was painting a mini, I'm like, I should take it out, but maybe I'll wait. So being intimidated to actually just start using the equipment you bought or painting the mini that you really like, I think you just kind of have to dive in and do it, or else you'll just be too intimidated to move forward. And if I wouldn't have just taken the chance and started with the Kingdom Rush models, then I feel like I would never have started next on the Bloodborne stuff pretty quickly after that. And the Bloodborne stuff, I felt like there was a lot of details in these models, but I watched some videos, and because a lot of them come in like batches of 4, you could start off with one and learn as you're going. And so when you start the next one, you could already kind of improve on how you're going to paint it. And then the next one and the next one, and then go back and kind of fix all the ones you started off with. So we have our brushes, and for my brush container, it's a dollar store cup. I think we bought these for one of my kids' birthdays. So I have like a Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle one and some emoji ones. I use those for just to have water, to rinse off my brushes, and to just hold my brushes in place. You should never store a brush with the bristles down. You should always store it with the bristles up. When you're drying it too, sometimes they say it's better to have them horizontally, but I've always just thrown them in here after I clean them. And so far it's been okay. But once again, I mostly use cheap brushes. So I don't want to give any advice for what you're going to do with a $30 brush, because I've never used a $30 brush. I've never owned a $30 brush. But for the dollar store level arts and craft brushes up into the $8 level, I say this is pretty much a good way to maintain them. The next thing to talk about is the paints. When you start working with these types of minis, the first thing you have to do is prime them. Some of the minis, when they come right out of the box, may have some type of material on them or chemical due to the manufacturing process. So being able to, sometimes you wash that off and then apply a primer of sorts will allow the paint to actually stick when you're painting them. So a primer is probably the first step of getting your minis ready for painting. Though some people also go through them with an X-Acto knife or a little bit of sandpaper or sanding file to go through the edges, because on a lot of miniatures, because they usually come out of a mold, they have that thin edge going along both sides of them, and it's where the mold comes together. And so filing that down or scraping it off with an X-Acto blade is usually what people do as a first step before they prime it. So I've only done that when I've seen some kind of extreme cases in regards to the edges on minis, but I usually don't do it. But then it comes to priming, there's multiple ways you could do it. You could have spray primer or you could have paint on primer. So I started with the spray primer, but because it was the middle of winter in Canada, it was very cold going outside, and spray paint doesn't work so well in very cold temperatures. So I quickly moved on to doing a paint on primer. And so I used this gesso because it was cheap and it came in a big bottle, but it paints on with a type of texture to it. It's kind of gritty. And so I mix it with water and I mix it with some paint, and that kind of smooths it out. And I find that to be a better approach to priming with gesso. I know some people like to do what's called zenithal priming, where you actually spray paint it black and then you spray painted a lighter color from the top to kind of simulate how light would fall on the object. So underneath is more shadowed and above is more light. I started off doing that, but I just found like it for me, the way I was painting it, I didn't really notice a difference, probably because I don't really have a good technique just yet in regards to how I put the paint on. So I stopped doing that, and now I just pretty much prime with the gesso plus a little bit of paint and water. And when we move on from priming, let's go to the paints themselves. I have a mixture of Citadel and Army Painter paints, but there's also Vallejo and I think Reaper are probably the big four in regards to minis. Most of the Army Painter paints are about $4 Canadian. The Citadel paints are about $4 or $5, though the contrast paints or the shades are about $10. So, but there's a bigger difference in size. So you have this size versus this size. And for all the Army Painters, they pretty much come the same, but there's a difference between paints and shades. And then there's also metallic paints. Metallic paints make sense, obviously, if you're painting swords, a lot of armor or jewelry, stuff like that. But there's also a thing called non-metallic metals. It's like a technique using just straightforward paints to make things look like metal. But I'm pretty basic with this stuff, so I just use my metallic paints. If you take a look at Ultron here, who I just finished this morning. For Ultron, I wanted him to look like metal, but I also wanted to add some shading to it. So I painted it all with gray shades and then white at the end. And I just dry brushed the metallic paint on to kind of give some of that glimmer to him. So it's always good to have a couple metallic paints. It's always good to have most of the basic colors, yellow, blue, red, white, and black. And that's pretty much what I started with, but very quickly I realized I don't like mixing colors. So buying a few more colors, I felt at the beginning, helped get the kind of looks I was going for. So I invested in these quick shades from Army Painters. I invested in there was a Zombicide pack that was pretty cheap that gave me some purples and some oranges. At the beginning, it was probably about an investment of $50 to buy one of those Army Painter all packs where it came with like all the colors you would kind of start off with and a shade. But over time, I've probably got more about $100 worth of paint here. My favorite paint to use right now is actually these Citadel paints because I find they're a very smooth consistency and they go on easily. Whereas with the Army paints, I often have to water them down a bit to get a good smooth flow out of the brush. But I do have more Army Painter paints than I have Citadel paints. See the ones with the red tops here? These are all of the shades. I happened to buy a box that came with 10 different shades. So it has colors all the way from black to blue to red to green. These are really good paints to use when you're working on models with a lot of details. So when I did the Bloodborne collection here, I used shades for a lot of them. And so if you take a look at the Cleric Beast, I just primed the Cleric Beast in a dark gray. And then the first thing I did was I coated it with a quick shade that was black. And that brought out a lot of the details in all of the hair. And then I just dry brushed on top of that. Dry brushing is a technique where you just put a bit of paint on the brush and then you dry it off on a paper towel or something like that. And then you lightly brush over the area you're trying to affect. And what it does is it really just lets the paint hit the top area. So all the raised areas. So if you take a look at the hair here, all the white hair on the legs, the arm, and on the back, it was just dry brushing white. And so it adds a lot of depth and it's a very easy technique. This model was probably one of the fastest models I ever painted. I did a quick shade, I did a bit of dry brushing, and then I finished it off with obviously some red over the horns and on the ribs and on the fingernails. Now, of course, other models, such as these ones, these each took me probably 3 or 4 hours because of the amount of details. It's like 3 people and they're all wearing different colors of clothes. And so in this one, I also used a wet blending technique where you actually take the paint and while it's still wet, you quickly get another color and you mix it in and it creates kind of like an even transition. So if you look closely at the flames, you can see there it goes from yellow to orange to red. Sometimes I find bigger models are easier depending on the design of the models themselves. So if you take a look at these church giants, mostly just a cloak and then some clothes underneath. But this was another one where it was just, I used a quick shade for his clothes and then I painted the cloak. It was a skeleton bone color and I did a dry brush with a white and it kind of creates that kind of texture of color over the cloak. It was a quick paint job. We've gone through the paints. I've kind of explained a bit between quick shades, contrast paints, and regular paints. Now for contrast paints, I only actually have one. It's kind of a label that Citadel has given to a line of its paints. And what it signifies is that the paint, putting on one coat of it, will kind of give you 2 different colors. So similar to like the quick shades, of course, quick shades are very glossy and very tacky. Because I only have the yellow, the only things I've used it on so far have been the collection of the Cthulhu Death May Die Haster group right here. When I started to play Gloomhaven with my daughter, after I painted the 4 main characters, I wanted to try and see what it would be like if we kind of put together some terrain to try and get those maps feeling a bit more 3-dimensional. And so I went to a website called Thingiverse, and Thingiverse, it has a collection of STL files so that you could actually 3D print them yourself. And I found doors, these kind of like stone walls, crates, treasure chests, stalagmites, barrels, and these kind of like stone pillars. And these were some of the first things the first things I printed, but also some of the first things I painted. Wood works very well with the quick shades. Same thing with stone. So you could literally paint it gray or prime it gray and then just add a quick shade to it, do a dry brush, and you'll get something that kind of turns out like this. Paint it, quick shade it, dry brush it. You can see all the different detail. So those were pretty quick to just get something on the table that looks really cool. Currently, I'm in the middle of painting 2 different games, so Marvel United and Cthulhu Death May Die, and I find the approaches to each very different. Obviously, Cthulhu is very dark, and as much as I wanted to use some bright colors for Haster, I'm sure once I get to Cthulhu himself and all the other characters in the game, there'll probably be a lot more like grays, blacks, greens, stuff like that. But Marvel United, I really wanted to approach it with a lot of color. So as you can see here with Red Skull, it's very bright. I want to use more of a comic book technique because if you look at the Marvel United graphics and the whole design of that game, it's pretty extreme in regards to the contrast and the light and shadow on the actual design of the characters themselves. So what I did with this was I just took the actual Red Skull cards from the box and I used it as a reference while I was painting him to try and see exactly where they had the highlights and the shades and all that stuff. And so it's pretty extreme if you take a look at it in regards to the colors, but I find it feels very much like a comic book and it suits the style of that game. With Bloodborne, I've seen people do very unique and different things for each version of the same character. So because they come in groups of 4, I wanted to make them all look the same, but if you go online and you do a quick search, you'll see that a lot of people go to very different extremes in regards to the colors used for each of these models. And what I'm starting to think about too is revisiting some of the things that I painted originally 4 or 5 months ago, because now that I have a bit more experience and I've learned a few more techniques, I think I could improve on a lot. And there's been some models that I've obviously rushed through because I just wanted to move on. Like the Void Warden from Gloomhaven, I'm not very happy with my paint job. This actually looks more like this would have been the first thing I ever painted, but it wasn't. This was probably 5th or 6th, but I literally didn't want to paint it. I just wanted to complete it so that I could move away from Gloomhaven because I was getting onto Bloodborne at that time. Whereas the other Gloomhaven models that I painted, I'm very happy with. There's just something about the Void Warden. This model here, because it was so small, was very challenging to paint because most of it was just like you really using the tip of the brush to put a dot of paint in certain areas. But while I was working on this, my father actually gave me these magnifying goggles, which of course, when you have them on, you look pretty funny, but they are so useful in regards to getting into the fine details. On Saturday, I was invited to hang out in my friend's backyard, and we kind of had like a Father's Day painting party. So there was 5 of us there. We all brought our own minis and we just painted together. And before that, I hadn't actually painted a mini for about a month. I had kind of like finished Bloodborne and finished a few other things I'd been working on. And then I kind of took a break and thought I should probably spend some time actually playing the games as opposed to just painting the minis. Because for Bloodborne, I actually played it once, started painting the minis, and it took me a month and a half before I finished that, before I would play it again. And I didn't want to keep doing that, yet I have this weird like OCD thing that if I am painting a game, I should probably paint the whole thing before I get it back to the table, because I don't want to have it on the table with partially painted minis or some minis that don't have paint. So I'm doing that right now with Marvel United, where I have the box on my table, but I don't want to play it again until I finish painting it. Though if I just finish painting the villains, I think that will give me like enough, I don't know, make me feel good enough to actually put it back on the table. And I tried to make a video while I was painting, but while I got distracted with the video and I felt like I couldn't concentrate. So I may try again in the next few days of filming my process as I paint. But I apologize that I didn't do it, even though I just did these yesterday, because I got too frustrated with the idea. But moving forward, I will make some videos about painting the minis and show some of the techniques I talked about today and walk you through the whole process, probably priming to, like painting, to dry brushing, the quick shades or the contrast paint, cleaning the brushes, using the wet palette, all of the different aspects I discussed today. I'll walk you through the whole thing. I hope that some of the things I discussed today was informative, and that maybe if you have an interest in kind of moving forward with painting minis, that this kind of could help guide you to how you could easily start. It's not as intimidating as even I thought it was at first. And once you just start doing it, you'll realize it's fun, enjoyable. It goes by really quick. Like even if, like for me, the Void Warden is probably my worst paint job. But when I see it on the table, I feel it's so much more interesting to look at than just the gray mini that comes in the box. So in my opinion, any type of paint job on a mini is better than no paint job on a mini. And you have to complete your first mini before you could get onto your second one. And then as you keep doing more and more, like I find this is a good example of where you can start and what you could kind of graduate up to, and then how you could just keep going. So if I take a look at this table, like I pretty much have my beginning as a miniature painter right here. Then I graduated up to this group over here, and then I'm currently working on these over here. But if you take a closer look at them, you could really see an evolution. And it's not a long evolution. It's like, 1 month, 2 months, 3 months type thing. But it's just about spending a bit of time every day or every week doing it so that you can actually improve. And it is possible. And with some of these techniques too, like dry brushing makes stuff look amazing. And the quick shades quickly make things look amazing too. Thanks again for hanging out. It's kind of cool to have all of the minis I've painted together on one table, because I get to see exactly how I've progressed over the past few months. And I've never done this before. I've only been looking at the model I'm currently painting, or I guess if I'm playing one of the games, I see them all on the table. But I'm excited to get through Marvel United and Cthulhu Death May Die, because they're 2 very different approaches and 2 very different styles in regards to colors and a technique. I'll try and revisit the minis in about a month or so when I've completed those 2 games, and I'll put them back and I'll see what I feel I've learned between now and then. And if I manage to set up the camera in a way that doesn't make me too stressed out the next time I'm painting, I'll make a video of the whole process and post it up on the channel. But for now, I think I'm going to say goodbye, and thanks again for hanging out, and I'll see you next time.